Rain poured over Manhattan like the sky was punishing someone. Keisha, a 30-year-old black maid with calm eyes and trembling hands, stood at the curb outside the glowing bar lights, staring at her boss, Ethan Walker, the billionaire everyone feared to question. His suit was soaked, tie hanging loose, voice slurred with whiskey and grief. "Ethan, please," she pleaded, stepping in front of his car door. "You can't drive like this." He laughed bitterly. "Since when does a maid tell me what I can't do?" "Since tonight," she said quietly, gripping his keys before he could. He lunged to grab them, but his foot slipped on the wet pavement. The sudden shove sent her stumbling backward. Her heel caught the curb, headlights flashed, a horn screamed. She fell hard, inches from a taxi's bumper. The driver cursed as water splashed over both of them. Ethan froze, the world spinning sober in one breath. "Keisha, are you—" "I'm fine," she whispered, rising slowly, rain dripping from her hair. "But you almost weren't." For a long second, neither spoke. Just thunder and shame hanging heavy in the air. And that was the moment everything began to change. If this already made your blood boil, hit like and subscribe right now. Because stories like this are still happening, and the world needs to hear them. Sunlight crept through the tall glass windows of Ethan's penthouse, exposing everything the night tried to hide. Keisha moved quietly through the kitchen, her wrists still sore from the fall. The smell of coffee filled the air, strong and bitter, like the silence between them. Ethan appeared in the doorway. Same man, different face. No arrogance, just exhaustion. His eyes were red, his voice low. "About last night," he began, "I don't expect forgiveness." Keisha didn't turn around. "Good," she said, "because forgiveness isn't what you need." He frowned. "Then what do I need?" She placed a cup of black coffee on the counter. Accountability. Start with that. For a moment, neither spoke. The ticking clock seemed louder than words. "I could have hurt you," he whispered. "But you didn't," she replied calmly. "You stopped. That's where change begins." Her quiet strength cut through his guilt like light through smoke. He sat down, rubbing his temples. "My wife used to talk like that," he said softly. "She believed people could be rebuilt." Keisha finally faced him, her eyes steady. "Then maybe she left that belief behind for someone to remind you." Ethan looked up at her, and for the first time, the billionaire didn't see a maid. He saw a woman who refused to let him drown in his own storm. Hours later, the storm had faded, but the tension between them hadn't. Keisha wiped down the long marble counter, pretending not to notice Ethan pacing near the window. His voice finally broke the silence. "I haven't been sober in months," he admitted quietly. "My wife, Clara, she kept me alive. When she died, I stopped trying." Keisha didn't flinch. "Grief doesn't give you permission to self-destruct," she said softly. "It gives you a reason to rebuild." He turned toward her, eyes searching. "You talk like you've lived this before." "I have," she said simply. "My mother fought cancer until the end. She never stopped believing life owed her one more sunrise." Ethan exhaled, defeated. "You sound like Clara," he whispered. "Maybe she sent me to remind you," Keisha replied. He looked at her, really looked, not as a maid, but as a person who had just held up a mirror to his brokenness. "I don't deserve your kindness," he murmured. "It's not kindness," she said. "It's hope, and it's running out if you keep drinking it away." Ethan's jaw tightened, but not from pride, from realization. For the first time in years, someone wasn't afraid to tell him the truth. If this happened right in front of you, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if you want justice as much as I do, hit subscribe. The next morning, Ethan called Keisha into his late wife's study, a quiet room filled with sunlight, papers, and forgotten dreams. He stood near a box labeled Clara Foundation Projects. His voice was calm now, sober, but heavy. She wanted to open housing centers for single mothers, fund scholarships, rebuild community clinics, he said. The board shut everything down after she passed. "I want to bring it back, but I don't know how." Keisha crossed her arms. "You start by asking people who know what struggle feels like." He raised an eyebrow. "Like you," She nodded. Like me? A pause hung between them, part disbelief, part respect. Then I want your help, he said, not as staff, as a voice. When the board heard, they laughed behind polished smiles. A maid, one whispered. Optics will kill this company. But Ethan didn't back down. Optics don't build hope, he said firmly. People do. And when Keisha walked into that boardroom, clean blouse, calm eyes, and unshakable truth, silence followed her like thunder. For the first time, she wasn't there to clean the table. She was there to turn it. The news broke faster than either of them expected. Billionaire appoints former Maid as director of foundation. Headlines rolled across morning shows and gossip feeds, each one dripping with sarcasm and hidden bias. Ethan watched from his office window as his phone buzzed nonstop. Board members, donors, PR advisors, all warning him he'd ruin his reputation. Downstairs, Keisha walked through the lobby, feeling every stare burn into her back. Whispers followed like shadows. She's just a maid. She'll never last. But she didn't flinch. She'd been judged before by landlords, managers, even teachers who thought kindness made her weak. Now she wore that judgment like armor. Inside the next meeting, a man in a gray suit spoke sharply. We can't risk millions on someone without a degree. Keisha met his eyes. Degrees build walls, she said. Experience builds bridges. Which one are you here for? Silence filled the room. Even Ethan couldn't hide the faint smile forming on his face. Later, when cameras gathered outside the building, reporters shouted questions. Keisha paused only once, looked straight into the lens, and said, maybe it's time we stop deciding who deserves to lead based on who's allowed to serve. And with that one sentence, the narrative began to shift. By the end of the week, the story had spread across the country. Some mocked her, some praised her, but everyone was talking about her. Keisha didn't hide. She stood at the steps of the newly reopened Clara Foundation Center, cameras flashing, the city watching. Her voice was calm but firm. I'm not here to play perfect, she said. I'm here to make sure people who've been ignored get seen. I used to scrub floors in this building. Now I'm rebuilding it. For every mother, worker, and child who thought their voice didn't matter. The crowd erupted in applause. Reporters shouted questions, but she kept her tone grounded. This isn't about me, she continued. It's about what happens when power finally listens to humility. Inside the boardroom, Ethan watched the live feed. The same executives who doubted her now sat in silence. Donations flooded in within hours. Small ones, big ones, names they hadn't seen in years. He turned to his assistant and said quietly, she didn't just save my life that night. She saved what was left of my soul. And for the first time since Clara's death, he smiled. Not the smile of a billionaire, but the peace of a man who'd finally found purpose again. Weeks later, the foundation's first housing project opened on a quiet street in Brooklyn. The walls were painted bright white. The floors gleamed and laughter echoed through the halls. Children running, mothers smiling, volunteers working side by side. Keisha stood near the doorway, clipboard in hand, watching the dream come alive. Ethan walked up beside her, no bodyguards, no arrogance, just gratitude in his eyes. You built this, he said softly. She smiled. No, we built this. You just remember how to care. He looked at her, the woman who once cleaned his mess, now cleaning his conscience. I used to think power meant control, he said. Now I know it means responsibility. Keisha nodded. Then keep using it right, because people are watching. As they stood under the afternoon light, the sign above the entrance caught the breeze. The Clara Foundation, rebuilt by compassion. Ethan turned to her. You ever think you'd be here? Keisha smiled faintly. No, but maybe I was meant to be. They watched a young boy run past, laughing. Hope had a sound again. If you believe this should never happen again, share this now. And to my USA, UK, and Canadian viewers, your voice is power. Use it.